American people want us to complete our work in a logical way, and this amendment helps us to do that. Mr. President, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this common-sense bipartisan approach. Mr. President, I see other members are now on the floor. I yield the floor.
Senator from Montana.
Oh, I still see a senator from Pennsylvania on the floor. Does he wish to speak on his amendment? Otherwise, I was going to speak on the First Amendment by Senator Portman.
I'd like to speak on my amendment at this time.
Fine. Go ahead.
Okay.
I'll speak later.
So, Mr. President, I have an amendment at the desk and ask for its consideration.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Pennsylvania would withhold. After he speaks, this gentleman from Montana will speak, and then may I be recognized on the other Portman amendment? I ask unanimous consent that I be recognized after the gentleman of Montana.
Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the pending amendment is set aside. The clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from Pennsylvania, Mr. Toomey, proposes amendment numbered 8.
So, Mr. President,
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you. I'd like to address the substance of this amendment, but let me start with a little context on this underlying bill. The underlying bill, of course, suspends the debt ceiling from now until May 18th. And what that means is that in the meantime, the administration will be able to borrow as much money as it wants within certain constraints, but a very, very large sum of money over the next 3.5 months, at which point the debt ceiling will be reinstituted at a higher level. We expect the government will probably borrow something on the order of $400 billion between now and such time as the debt ceiling is reestablished. We've got $16.4 trillion in debt today, so by the time the debt ceiling is reapplied, reimposed, it'll be just under $17 trillion. Now, at that point, we'll be right back to the standoff that we were at very recently. Standoff over what to do about this massive amount of debt we already have and the massive amount of additional debt that the administration would like to create. Now, the administration's position is very clear. They want additional borrowing authority with no strings attached, no conditions, no limits on future spending. They just want to be able to keep borrowing. And some on our side of the aisle feel very strongly that any increase in the debt ceiling that authorizes still more borrowing needs to be accompanied with some measure of spending discipline so that we can at some point begin to regain control over these out-of-control deficits and the debt. Well, in any case, what we know for sure is that this tension will reemerge and that we don't have a resolution in place now. And if this measure passes, which very likely it will, and it'll be signed into law, we've just kicked this can down the road until May, maybe June or July at the most. But we surely will be back at this point where we're having this argument. Here's what else we know. We know that tax revenue, ongoing tax revenue coming into the government's coffers are going to be about 75% of all the money the government's planning to spend in the coming year, likely to spend. And since 75% doesn't cover everything, the other 25% is meant to be borrowed. And therein lies the necessity of raising the debt ceiling precisely to fund the difference between all that the government wants to spend and the tax revenue that's going to happen. And it's important to note, by the way, that raising this debt ceiling is not about paying for past bills incurred. I know that's repeated around here all the time. It's totally untrue. We have a funding for the appropriations process expires at the end of March. There is no appropriation that's in place going forward. The debt ceiling increase, the authority to borrow more money, is all about funding future spending, which is part of the reason why some of us think this is a very sensible moment to try to bring some discipline to that future spending. And what would happen if we don't raise the debt ceiling right away? Well, if we don't, we'd have to have a 25% cut in all government spending, and that's pretty massive. That's pretty problematic. Now, the administration and some actually go way overboard in the threats that they attach to this. They threaten to inflict the maximum possible economic damage if the debt ceiling isn't raised promptly upon the point at which they run out of their maneuvering room. So you hear threats about a default on our debt, and senior citizens won't get their Social Security check, and our military folks won't get paid. All kinds of the most disruptive, most damaging, and most dangerous kinds of outcomes are threatened by the administration. Now, this is unnecessary. This isn't true. This isn't what would happen. But there's an incentive, of course, to try to scare and intimidate Republicans into giving the administration the unconditional ability to just keep on borrowing and spending as they've been doing, and that's why we hear this. Well, what my amendment does is it's an attempt to absolutely minimize the disruption, the danger, and the drama. It's an attempt to get away from government by cliff and to have a sensible approach to bringing our spending under control. It's called the Full Faith and Credit Act, and what it does, it says very simply, since none of us can guarantee that the debt ceiling is going to be raised on any particular date, I mean, we all know how we're going to vote. We can't control anyone else's vote. We certainly can't control a single vote in the House, and we can't control what the president might do. Therefore, we can never know for sure whether and when and under what circumstances the debt limit will be raised. So my point is the sensible and prudent and responsible thing to do is have a plan to minimize the downside if the debt ceiling is not raised immediately upon reaching it. This has nothing to do, by the way, with the current circumstances of suspending the debt ceiling. This is all about the next time in May or June or July when we find ourselves facing these circumstances. So what my bill says is if we get to that point, the federal government would be obligated to prioritize three categories of spending. That would be interest on our debt to make sure that we don't default on our debt and create a financial crisis. It would be Social Security payments to everybody who qualifies for a Social Security payment so that no senior citizen has to worry and wait to get their check. And it would be active duty military personnel so that no soldier has to worry or wonder whether they're going to get paid. And by the way, what my bill does, it goes a step further and says not only will the federal government have to prioritize those three categories, but it says in the event that on any given day the tax revenue were not sufficient to cover those three payment obligations, the Treasury Secretary would be authorized to borrow additional amounts to ensure that those payments were made. So what does it do? It guarantees that it would be absolutely impossible under any circumstances to default on our debt, to miss a Social Security payment to anyone, or to be late with the military pay to anybody. That's what it would do. It would take a little bit of the drama and the risk and the uncertainty and the potential damage to the economy off the table and allow us to have an honest, sensible discussion about how we're going to get spending under control. Now, mind you, these three categories of spending, if you add them all up together cumulatively, they account for about 1/3 of all the spending the government is scheduled to engage in over the course of this fiscal year. Ongoing tax revenue is about 3/4 of all the spending that's going to occur. So clearly there's far more than enough tax revenue to cover these items, but tax revenue comes in a lumpy fashion. It doesn't come in smoothly and uniformly over the course of the year, hence the provision that allows the Treasury Secretary to borrow in the event that they needed to in the short run to smooth that out. But let me say something that's more fundamentally important here. This amendment is not intended to be a replacement for raising the debt ceiling. Unfortunately, as long as we're running structural deficits, we're going to have to borrow money to fund that. This amendment, if it were to pass and be signed into law, doesn't mean we wouldn't have to raise the debt ceiling at some point. Of course, we're going to have to until we get to the point where we've got balanced budgets and don't have to continue to run deficit spending. And by the way, I don't think that it's desirable or optimal to cross into that threshold where we are living under the rules of prioritization, because it's very disruptive to not be paying all the other bills on time as we ought to. That's much better. But my point is, there's something even more important here, and that is to fundamentally bring our spending and deficits under control. trillion-dollar deficits, a total debt that now exceeds the total economic output of our country. We've got a disastrous fiscal situation on our hands. It's right now costing us jobs, costing us economic growth today, and it's guaranteed to result in a full-blown fiscal crisis and a meltdown if we don't change the path we're on. The only time we've ever been able to persuade this president to agree to significant spending reductions was the last time we argued over the debt limit. And we did end up getting spending cuts as part of that. So I think the urgency of getting our spending under control and getting our fiscal house in order so that we can avoid a fiscal crisis and have the kind of economic recovery we need, that's what necessitates a prioritization bill so that we can take the shrill excesses and the threats that some are claiming, take that off the table and have a discussion, a real discussion, and real solutions about how we're going to get spending under control. Mr. President, my strong hope is that we can bring an end to government by cliffs. Senator Portman has an amendment, I believe, that he's going to introduce which would prevent the danger of a government shutdown in the event that a CR, continuing resolution, expires. Makes all the sense in the world. We shouldn't find ourselves backed up against the wall at midnight on December 31st with a great calamity threatened if we don't pass some bill that nobody's ever seen. This is a terrible way to run the government, and that's what we've been doing. So what my bill does is it eliminates the risk of default, and it says, it creates the opportunity for us to bring some spending discipline and associate it with any future debt limit increase. Senator Portman's bill will avert the risk of a government shutdown. I fully support his other efforts to make sure that we have $1 in savings for every new dollar in debt we create. We've got an obligation to do that. We've already got too big a debt burden. We've got to begin curbing the problem that causes it, and that is too much spending. So, Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. As I say, it will not have any effect on the specific bill under consideration to temporarily suspend the debt limit. It will make a much more manageable and much less disruptive discussion when we address the debt limit once again in May or June, or when that day surely will arrive. And with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, I have 2 unanimous consent requests. First, I have 4 unanimous consent requests for the committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. We have the approval of the majority and minority leaders, and I ask consent that these requests be agreed to and these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I ask consent the following staff and Finance Committee have floor privileges for the 113th Congress: Ashton Jenny, Daniel West, Eva Hampel, Gavin Mathis, Andrew Vondel, and Brian Watt.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I'd like to speak on 2 amendments. There'll be the first amendment offered by the Senator from Ohio. That is his first amendment. And also I'll speak on the amendment offered by the Senator from Pennsylvania. I think the Senator from Maryland, Chairman of the Appropriations Committee, will speak on the second Portman amendment. Mr. President, I chuckle this morning. I see 2 new members, very, very, very able members of the United States Senate, who are now members of the Senate Finance Committee, just follow their urges to offer amendments immediately to bills before the Senate. Senator Portman's doing that. Senator Toomey's doing that, and I commend them. I very much commend them for being so interested in the subject and allowing their intellectual juices flow to come up with something that's new and different, and in their view it might make some sense. And I think part of this is because of the newly found efforts here in the Senate and desire in the Senate, certainly among rank-and-file members, to do something. What you hear around here is regular order. That's something I very much subscribe to, namely when the committees do their work. And Senator Portman and Senator Toomey are certainly following that tradition by offering amendments so that the Senate Finance Committee, in this case the Senate floor, is doing its work with respect to the pending measure. I want to start by saying how much I appreciate the Speaker's efforts, Speaker Boehner. The Speaker has done, in my judgment, a good job of giving us a few months breathing room here in the Congress with respect to the debt limit increase. That is, by having the House pass on a bipartisan basis measure which extends the debt ceiling limit for another several months to May 18th. That gives us a chance to figure out how we're going to get our fiscal house better in order, cut debt, and deal with some other vexatious issues like the sequester and the continuing resolution. The amendment, I must say, though, offered by my good friend from Ohio, is really a throwback to an effort that was undertaken essentially a year or two ago, and with all due respect, just didn't work. What was that? Namely, it's the Sanders Amendment, which is say for every dollar increase in national debt, there'd be a dollar cut in federal spending. This was something that was tried. The House of Representatives tried with the Speaker and negotiated with the President. It just didn't work. Frankly, it led to a big confrontation, if you will, August 11th, where the debt was reaching its limit. There's no agreement on spending cuts, and the credit agencies began to downgrade U.S. credit. And it just didn't work. And I again say that's why I'm very proud of the Speaker for trying a different approach. It's also important to point out that if this amendment were to pass, we'd have to send this bill back to the House. We're already now on a track, a good track, for the Senate to pass without amendment the House-passed bill. Because if that happens, then the world knows that the United States government will not be in debt for at least May 18th, and because of measures the Treasury Secretary can take, probably will not exceed his debt limit until sometime in August. We'll be in debt, really. We have a big debt, about $16 trillion debt. But we will not reach our debt limit if the House bill is passed by the United States Senate. It is very important, in my judgment, that we pass this House amendment so that we in the Senate and the House of Representatives can get to work on how we reduce the debt and how we get our house in order as best we possibly can. But I want to again thank my friend from Ohio for his approach. This dollar for dollar has been attempted in the past. It's been rejected by the Speaker of the House of Representatives. It's been rejected by the majority of the House of Representatives, that is his party. His idea was once tried. It just didn't work. And I submit, with all due respect, that it wouldn't work this time either for the reasons I mentioned and for the additional reason that would just further complicate an effort to increase our debt limit for a short period of time, which allows us to work within our, to do our work. Mr. President, I'd like to now turn to the Toomey Amendment. I again thank my colleague from Pennsylvania, new member of the committee, for his industriously coming up with an idea. I must say with total respect, I think the idea doesn't work. Basically, the idea is that when a debt limit is reached, the limit would be increased only for the purpose of addressing principal and interest on the debt held by the public, or Social Security benefits and military pay. That's it. That is, that debt limit is automatically increased only for those three reasons, and not for other reasons. That is, not for other programs that the United States government has an obligation to fund. What are some of them? Medicare, veterans benefits, disability benefits, Medicaid, Pell Grants, special education for disabled children, highway funding. The list is extremely lengthy. I've just a couple of few. So what happens if the Toomey Amendment is law? If the Toomey Amendment is law, first of all, we've reached our debt limit. So what are the credit markets going to think? What are credit agencies going to think? They're going to think, oh my gosh, the United States Congress has not increased the debt limit, but for, on a daily basis, essentially, Social Security, interest on the debt, and military pay. Not military procurement, not men and women who are in Air Guard, our Guard, just military pay. It's not active duty pay is what it sounds like. And then just think what's going to happen. Just think of the chaos. Other people, other agencies aren't going to know whether they're going to be funded or not. They have no idea. According to the Toomey Amendment, well, it's up to the Treasury Secretary to prioritize. But how can he do that when there's no money there, when the debt limit's not been increased for them? I mean, I cannot believe that this amendment, frankly, is even offered. It's just so nonsensical. All through due respect to my friend from Pennsylvania. So with respect to the two amendments being offered here, the first, the Portman Amendment, I say to my friends, it's been tried. Passed, didn't work. Didn't work when the President and Speaker were trying to negotiate a deal on August 11th. Didn't work. Caused chaos in the markets. That's one of the reasons the market fell so much back in August 2011, this approach. Second, this amendment, if it's agreed to, requires sending this bill back to the House. It'll mean putting this issue of extending the debt limit increase for 3 months in tremendous jeopardy. I don't think we want to do that. I think it's the wrong thing to do. And the Second Amendment, the Toomey Amendment, is totally unworkable. It will cause even more chaos at a time when we're trying to calm the markets, at a time we're trying to get more confidence, more credibility, not less. In my judgment, both amendments, especially the latter, would require a lot more worry in the markets, not more confidence, more worry, more uncertainty. And it's for those reasons I think these amendments should be rejected. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I stand as the chair of the full Appropriations Committee to respond to two Portman amendments. We'll comment on one and speak to the one related to automatic CRs, which is in the jurisdiction of the Appropriations Committee. But as to the dollar-for-dollar cuts, which the gentleman from Montana, the chair of the Finance Committee, has spoken to, I just want to say I absolutely support his position, agree as an appropriator, agree with his arguments. It would make the dollar-for-dollar cuts would make the Boehner rule permanent. It would raise the debt limit by mandating $1 trillion cut in spending. This amendment could allow a minority of 41 senators to dictate the fiscal policy to the majority. I ask unanimous consent that my full statement supporting the position taken by the gentleman from Montana be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Now, Mr. President, I would also like to rise to oppose the Portman Amendment related to automatic continuing resolutions. Now, what does the amendment do? It sounds good. And I must say, I have a great admiration for this senator from Ohio, and he has a well-known reputation for working on a bipartisan basis. He has worked so well when he was in the House with my colleague, Senator Cardin. And I look forward to having these kinds of discussions and seeing how we can work out some of these issues. Because I think in listening to the debate, I think we all are in agreement of goals, but we disagree on means. Now, his amendment, as I read it, says if Congress fails to pass an appropriations bill or a continuing resolution related to it, instead of a government shutdown, an automatically continuing resolution would go into effect. Now, that sounds good. However, there's an additional part that says every 3 or 4 months that Congress fails to replace the CR, it would decrease agency funding by 1% across the board. Well, that sounds pretty good, too, because after all, what is 1%? Well, 1% every month compounded has draconian results. this amendment would set up essentially the framework for mini sequesters that would go into effect automatically if Congress doesn't pass that appropriation. Now, I agree with the gentleman from Ohio. We need to follow a regular order, which means bring up appropriations bills one by one, open, transparent, debatable. If you want to save or shave, offer amendments. It would, if we had regular order, we would be able to pass our bills. Now, you can't have a situation in the Congress where we haven't been able to bring up bills because of the filibusters, because of the deleterious tactics of some members. We can't bring them up. We're punished for it. I oppose his amendment for 3 reasons. Amendment is the wrong solution. Regular order is the solution. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, in deference to the senator from...
We're in a quorum call.
I'm sorry. I asked quorum call be officiated.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, in deference to the senator from Maryland, I went through the same cold and cough and crud that caused her to begin coughing, and so I fully understand why she needed to just take a break. And I'm more than willing to step aside when she comes back, but since I'm next up, in the interest of time, I know we are trying to move toward a vote here at 12:15. I'd like to proceed, and then I'll be happy to suspend when the senator comes back. Mr. President, this afternoon the Senate will vote on a bill recently passed by the House to suspend the debt ceiling for 4 months. First, I would like to commend the House on one aspect of the legislation, which I strongly support, and that is the suspension of salary for members of Congress if we do not pass a budget by April 15th. As I mentioned on the floor yesterday, Congress by law is required to pass a budget, but it's been nearly 4 years since it has done so. And as a result, the Senate has blatantly ignored our legal duty, not to mention our moral duty, to enact a budget. This is completely irresponsible, and quite frankly, it's embarrassing. So if this body can't fulfill its most fundamental duty under law to pass a budget, then I say we don't deserve to get paid. However, another aspect of the bill that would suspend enforcement of the federal debt limit until at least May, and according to recent statements issued by the administration, possibly until August, that concerns me. And I understand why the House has taken this approach for political, tactical reasons, but unfortunately, this decision only continues the practice of governing from crisis to crisis, from cliff to cliff, and pushing through flawed, haphazard legislation at the last minute like we did with the vote on the fiscal cliff. A great example of how this body should not function. As a result of this practice, members are left with deciding between choosing the lesser of two evils. Never again will I, nor I believe many of my colleagues, support any legislation that is negotiated in secret, bypasses the regular process where we have an opportunity to take it up in committee and amend it if necessary, and then present it to the Senate for debate and evaluation or amendment. Never again will I support something that takes us into the wee hours of the night, into the New Year's Eve and into New Year's Day, and then just have a few minutes to try to evaluate it with no debate, no opportunity to amend. This is no way to govern a country. It's no way to strengthen a weak economy and spur job creation, and it's no way to restore confidence among consumers and investors, such a critical factor in making for a robust growth, which we are not enjoying right now. Eventually, all of us have to stand up and say enough is enough. Pushing these debates up until the last minute, creating our own fiscal cliffs and passing short-term measures must cease. I've had enough of it. People of Indiana have had enough of it. The American people across the country have had enough of Washington postponing real action on the most serious challenge facing our country, namely the out-of-control spending into further deficit and debt. Both Republicans and Democrats, the President and the Congress, liberal and conservative economists and nonpartisan people all agree that our continued increase in debt is unsustainable. And we all know that what has been fueling this fire has engulfed our fiscal house, its spending. But our meager efforts to date to address this looming fiscal calamity are like trying to put out a five-alarm fire by an occasional squeeze of a squirt gun. I now note, Mr. President, that the senator from Maryland has returned to the floor, and if she would like to resume at this point, I'd be happy to yield time or suspend my remarks.
Is that okay with you?
That is okay with me, and I'd be happy to do
Well, I thank the senator for the courtesy. Both the gentleman from Montana and I have been hit by this bug, and
2 weeks ago, so I fully understand what the senator was going through.
well, little germs are doing to me what my opponents couldn't, which is stop me from talking. So I thank the senator for his courtesy. All I wanted to say is I oppose this amendment for 3 reasons. It's about cutting, not keeping the government open with 1% cuts every 90 days. The amendment should be solved by regular order, and the amendment gives up constitutional responsibility. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent my full statement be in the record. I yield the floor.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President.
Senator from Indiana.
My sympathy and empathy to the senator from Maryland, and having gone through the same thing, I fully understand what she's dealing with and trust that she will recover quickly. Picking up where I left off, dare a politician stand here and acknowledge this? Many don't want to, but the truth is this: the main driver of our debt and deficit spending is the runaway mandatory spending on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security to some extent. Despite those who claim that it's political suicide to touch these programs, and despite the fact that none of us are saying we should eliminate these programs, this is an area where many don't want to tread. But I believe these programs, which provide much-needed benefits for many Hoosiers and Americans, need to be preserved. But our goal and our challenge here is to find common ground on not how to eliminate these programs, but how to save these programs, both for current retirees and for future generations. But if we don't take steps to reform these programs, we risk not only bankrupting our country, we risk having to tell the recipients of the benefits of these programs that we no longer can fulfill their needs and our promises. So, Mr. President, it's difficult for me to support any effort to increase the debt limit when we continue to avoid taking the necessary steps to eliminate deficit spending and control our debt in the future. Despite several bipartisan attempts over the last 2 or 3 years, including efforts by the Simpson-Bowles Committee, the President's Committee, the Gang of Six, and the Super Committee of 12, we have failed to put together a credible long-term debt reduction package. So how then can we continue to raise the debt limit over and over again without agreeing on a way to reduce it in the future? Repeatedly and thoughtlessly raising the debt limit represents a political moral hazard, a taxpayer bailout for big government politicians who don't want to be bothered by controlling spending. Congress continually increasing the debt limit is akin to consumers having the ability to increase their own credit card borrowing limit with no oversight. We just keep increasing the credit limit to pay for more and more spending. It's like, reminds me of the parent dealing with the irresponsible teenager who was given a credit card, asked to stay within the credit limits, but month after month after month continues to exceed those as the debt piles up and the interest on the debt accumulates. Eventually, the parent has to take away the card and take the scissors and cut it up. At what point do we in the Congress take the congressional credit card, cut it up, and get control of our spending? I urge my colleagues and the President to focus not on how to get enough votes to raise the borrowing limit again, but focus on how truly we can begin the essential task of eliminating deficit spending and reducing our debt as a percentage of GDP. You know, part of what makes America so remarkable is that we have the ability in this great country to control our destiny. The problems we face are not insurmountable, but they are not avoidable either. And it's time we take a stand and do what the people we represent sent us here to do. It's time we make the changes we pledged we would make when we were seeking office. And it's time we take control of our country's financial future and put America on a path to prosperity. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
As you can see, the Senate's in a quorum call waiting for a member to speak. They're currently working on a bill that would suspend the debt limit until May 19th. About 12:45 to 2:15 Eastern, the chamber will recess for caucus meetings. Off the floor this morning, the Senate Armed Service Committee is holding a confirmation hearing for Chuck Hagel to be the next defense secretary. You can watch that live coverage of that hearing right now over on C-SPAN. Also live on C-SPAN today, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton will give what may be her last public remarks as Secretary of State. She'll be speaking at the Council on Foreign Relations, and we'll have live coverage of that also over on C-SPAN at 2 p.m. And on C-SPAN 3, Senate Democratic leaders will talk about immigration policy. That's live at noon Eastern Time.
Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm going to lay out and discuss a motion to commit, which I have at the desk, and we're going to be voting on that motion to commit later today. Very simple, very straightforward. In fact, I'll read it. Mr. Vitter moves to commit the bill, H.R. 325. That's, of course, the debt limit increase, which we have at the desk, which we're debating, to the Committee on Finance, with instructions to report the same back to the Senate within 7 days with legislative language that makes changes in existing programs that reduce federal spending by the increased amount required by Section 2B over the fiscal years 2013 to 2022, close quote. So, Mr. President, it's real simple. Whatever we're increasing the debt limit by, we're reducing spending. And the idea is that we start actually paying for what we spend, or at least paying for the extra we're going to borrow. It's a common sense idea, a straightforward approach, and it's not draconian. We can do it, but it starts to put discipline into the process. This bill before us suspends the debt limit until May 18th. That's estimated to mean between $300 billion and $400 billion in additional deficit spending. So, under this motion to commit, that's the savings we'd find. Those are the cuts we'd make, $300 to $400 billion total over 10 years. Obviously, that's $30 to $40 billion a year. That, Mr. President, is thoroughly doable. It's meaningful, takes some work, but it's thoroughly doable. And those savings would be such a small percentage. The part for this year would only be about 3% of the deficit, around 1% of total federal spending. Mr. President, if we can't find between $30 and $40 billion a year in savings, is there really a way we can agree to major budget reforms? And if we can't find those modest savings, should we really be borrowing more money to just spend and spend and spend? Now, let me be clear, Mr. President, my limited motion is not enough. We need more spending cuts, and we need more and fundamental budget reform, and we need it now. But I am proposing a reasonable first step, concrete, meaningful, as a down payment toward fiscal sanity. So this bill is short-term. It's a patch. It's 3 months. But it puts us on the right path. It's a concrete, meaningful first step. Surely we should have learned by now. Congress passed the last debt limit deal in 2011, but we got a credit downgrade anyway. Now, as we continue just to rack up more and more debt without spending reform, without budget reform, a new downgrade has to be on the way. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. All the credit rating agencies have maintained their negative outlook, including after the fiscal cliff deal. The problem, as it was with the deal passed on New Year's Day, is not that we're taxed too little. The problem is we clearly spend too much. Not enough folks in this building recognize that. Everybody in the real world recognizes that, and certainly the credit rating agencies recognize that. So why don't we take this reasonable, concrete first step? Again, my modest amendment is a small down payment, but an important step, concrete action during the time this bill would increase debt for as we work toward a more comprehensive solution. If we're going to raise the debt limit, we must at least show the taxpayers, the credit rating agencies, the world, that we're serious about getting our fiscal house in order. Without this type of amendment, or in this case a motion to commit, we're not saying that in any way, shape, or form with this bill. And that's why without this sort of motion to commit or a roughly similar amendment, I cannot vote for this debt limit increase. I urge all of my colleagues to join me in a bipartisan way around this approach. I think it would be a step in the right direction, and I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, the debt limit alone under the current administration had been increased by over $5 trillion, and that's simply unsustainable. Not to worry, I have recently been told we have made massive progress towards promising deficit reduction. I hear this even though we haven't seen any significant actual reduction. I've been hearing bold claims by my friends on the other side of the aisle about having attained trillions of budget, quote, savings, unquote, and deficit reduction in just the past couple of years alone. They've gone so far as saying that we've had $2.4 trillion of deficit reduction legislated in the past 2 years. Of course, the deficit reduction has not been realized. It represents promises and plans that even Democrats seek to undo. It's amazing to me that they make these claims. I've heard bold claims that we have somehow legislated deficit reduction totaling as much as $3.6 trillion from my friends on the other side. I've heard that deficit reduction that has been promised can be broken down to an 80-to-20 ratio of spending cuts to tax hikes. And while I often applaud creativity, I have to say that these deficit reduction claims and the ratio of spending reductions to tax hikes is more than creative. It is more like Enron accounting. And if you were running a company in the private sector and made such claims, you probably would end up in jail. Let me make a few brief comments on the Democrats' Enron accounting of deficit reduction. First, the so-called spending cuts they identify have not yet been realized. And even they are working hard to undo some of them, if not all of them. Second, the so-called spending cuts are only cuts if you are selective in the starting point that you use to measure whether spending is being cut or not. Relative to what spending levels would be had we not had a Democrat spending spree, spending has increased even if you include plans put forward in the Budget Control Act, which have not yet been realized. Third, the spending cut to tax hike number thrown around by my friends on the other side of the aisle counts only one discrete tax hike, the one associated with the fiscal cliff bill. Why do Democrats want to entirely ignore that massive tax hikes associated with Obamacare that have already gone into effect with more to come? Fourth, spending cuts that my friends on the other side of the aisle are banking when they devise their Enron accounting have not yet been set in place. Until fiscal year 2013 comes to a close, those spending reductions have not actually occurred. And Congress has a long history of promising cuts without delivering. It is ironic for me that my friends on the other side of the aisle fight tooth and nail against any true reductions in the outside spending of the current administration. Then, when budget realities force considerations of reductions and legislation is passed promising reductions, Democrats boast of having cut spending to reduce deficits. Finally, when it comes to actually implement any spending cuts, Democrats want to undo them and replace them with yet more taxes. And that's what we're hearing from the other side with regard to the sequestration. Mr. President, I believe that our country faces a large spending problem and that our debt is too big and grows too fast. I believe that presenting a picture of our finances that would pass muster only in the Enron accounting department is a disservice to the American people. If my friends on the other side of the aisle want more tax hikes to pay for more spending, then they should just say so. And some of them do, by the way, and I compliment them for doing that, even though I think it's crazy. Cloaking their desires in manufactured claims that we have somehow cut spending 4-to-1 relative to tax hikes is simply dishonest. And I don't think I've been wrong in calling it Enron accounting. And frankly, I'm getting a little sick of it because they throw these figures around as though they're really tax cuts, and they are not tax cuts. And they never will be, according to my friends on the other side, and what their actions really show. So it's important that we get rid of the fuzz and get rid of the buzz and get rid of the phony stuff and the Enron accounting and start realizing that we need to have some real tax reductions. And frankly, we need to have some real spending reductions. Even if we can't get tax reductions, we ought to all be working on spending reductions. We ought to be looking for every aspect of this economy, every aspect of our budget, every aspect of our legislation, and we ought to be looking for as many spending reductions as we can find. Spending is out of control. And even today, you know, they're going to be spending well over 22% of GDP, according to the best of estimates. And when I saw the economic results of yesterday that were in the paper of this really slow growth, it ought to be waking everybody up on both sides of the aisle that we're not doing our jobs. And the reason we're not doing our jobs is because we phony up these numbers that aren't really spending reductions. And then we act like everything's hunky-dory when, in fact, things are not hunky-dory. We're in real trouble in this country, and it's inexcusable to let the greatest country in the world have to go through this type of charade because we're unwilling to face the music that every individual family in this country has to face on balancing their budgets and on balancing ours. Well, I just think it's time to cut the charade and quit talking about spending reductions that don't materialize and amount to nothing but Enron accounting. Mr. President, I ask that both sides, that both sides be charged for the time.
That is the order.
And suggest the absence of the quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Mr. President,